Okay, let's begin, and let's begin by reminding you that there's an exam in this class next week on Wednesday. There'll be a review in class by the GSIs on Monday. I've already distributed an announcement about the narrative review that I posted to the course website. I've got some accommodation notices for students in the DSP program, but if there are any others that I should have, got to get those to me as soon as possible so we can make the appropriate arrangements. The exam, as announced, will cover all required readings and lectures to date, so the introductory lecture and Gleitman's Chapter 1, the lectures on biological bases of behavior and Gleitman's Chapters 2 and 3, lectures on learning in Gleitman's Chapter 6, and lectures on sensation and perception, which are today and Wednesday, and Gleitman's Chapters 4 and 5. We will not be having questions on the statistical appendix on this exam, okay? But we will have some questions on that material on the final exam. There are lots of resources for the exam. As mentioned, there's going to be a review in class on Monday. The GSIs are not going to attempt to cover all the lecture material or all the textbook material, but they will be here and available to answer any last-minute questions that you may have. The study guide for the Gleitman text is pretty good. Very good guide to not only the content of the exam, but also the style of questions. Gleitman was one of my teachers. I'd like to think I think like he does. There are lots of materials on the course website. There are lecture supplements. There are copies of past exams, all of which with the answers, most of which with some analysis. In addition, if you have any last-minute questions, or any questions at all, if you post them to the forum on the course website by noon on Tuesday, either I or the GSIs will do our best to get a response to you back by the end of business that day. Okay, so there are lots of things available. The exam format, size of the class dictates multiple choice testing, but even if it didn't, we'd probably do it, because multiple choice tests are the best tests. They're objective, they're reliable, there's no worry about whether the GSI was tired when he or she was reading your exam or whatever. They just run through the computer and that's it. Roughly half of the questions are drawn directly from the lectures, roughly half are drawn from the text, there's overlap. Make sure that you come to class with the proper red Scantron form, which you can buy at the ASUC bookstore and at other venues around campus. I know they're at Pat Brown's Grill. And bring a couple of number 2 pencils, because you can't fill these things in with ink. You got to fill them in with pencil. This is what the Scantron form looks like. This is the front, this is the back. I've already got an example of that on the narrative review that I posted to the course website. But if you have any doubts, like one year there were 2 different red Scantron forms. This is the one. It's about 4 by 8 or 9 or something like that. That's the front. That's the back. Focus of the exams, as always, is on basic concepts and principles. At this level of the course, we're just trying to give you some appreciation of how your minds work. Yeah? So they're not going to be questions about picky details. At least I don't think they're picky details. I took the exam the other night. I passed. We also don't ask you about specific experiments. However, I might name an investigator or I might refer to an experiment as a way of helping you retrieve the basic concept or principle that's associated with that experiment, okay? So if I talk about Garcia's experiment on taste aversion learning, the first thing that should go off in your head is the arbitrariness assumption and the preparedness principle. If I ask you about Kahneman's experiment on the blocking effect, the first thing that should go off in your head is association by contingency and predictability and surprise. Okay, that's how that works. So we want you to recognize the implications of studies, but we don't need you to memorize studies themselves. Okay, that's pretty much all I have to say about the exam for now. Any questions about the format of the exam? Yes? No, the statistical appendix that you're not going to be responsible for on the midterm is the appendix. It's in the back of the book. But it was assigned in the readings for the introductory lectures, along with Chapter 1. It's in the back of the textbook. All appendices are always in the back of the textbook. But since it's not on the exam, I wouldn't go looking for it right now. Okay? Don't worry about the statistical appendix for now. You'll have plenty of time to worry about it. Anything else about the exam? Yes? At the ASUC bookstore, okay? Or there are other places around campus. When I go get lunch at Pat Brown's Grill, I see them at the cashier's desk. Yes? 50. Okay, that's up here. Okay, anyway, it's 50. 50, okay. And that's perfectly doable in the 50 minutes you've got, okay? So just get here, get settled in, pass out the exams, take the exam, turn in the exam. And that. Make sure you keep a record of your answers on your exam form. You don't turn in the exams, you just turn in the Scantron forms, because right after the exam, the preliminary scoring key will go up and you can check your answers. Okay? Immediate feedback. Good psychological principle of learning. Anything else about the exam? Okay, if you have any other questions, we can catch them up on Wednesday or just post them to the course website. Okay, last time we talked about some basic phenomena of learning, and one of the major thrusts of those lectures was that learning is not just a matter of changing behavior, bringing behavioral responses under the control of various environmental stimuli. Rather, we want to think about learning in terms of a change in knowledge, okay? That an organism acquires new knowledge about the world that, at the very least, enables it to predict and control what's going to go on in its environment. That's true for the dogs and cats and rats and rabbits usually used in animal conditioning experiments, but it's even more true for humans. We understand now that human beings are cognitive beings. Our behaviors go beyond mere associations between stimuli and responses. We do a lot more than reflex, taxis, instinct, conditioned responses. Instead, our behavior is intelligent. It's based on our knowledge about the world. And so what we have to do, if we're going to understand behavior, is we have to understand how organisms, especially humans, acquire knowledge, how it's stored in the mind, how it's used in various ways, and how it's communicated to other people. And that's what cognitive psychology is all about, what we're going to be talking about for the next many weeks in this course. We want to know how organisms, especially humans, acquire information about the world, store it, use it, and communicate it. And the first step in that process is acquiring knowledge about the world. Forming mental representations of ourselves, forming mental representations of the things that we experience, and then making use of those representations in various ways. This gets at a question that has bedeviled philosophers for a couple of thousand years, which is to say, how is it that we know the world? How is it that we get knowledge about the world? And in philosophy, at least, the philosophical responses to this question, philosophical answers to this question, boil down to one of two answers. There's a group of philosophers known as nativists who argued that our knowledge is innate, that it comes to us independent of our sensory experience, essentially that we're born knowing everything we're going to know. And the contrary point of view is what's known as empiricism, and basically the idea behind empiricism is that knowledge is acquired through experience, or through our reflections on experience. Now, we now know that there are certain forms of knowledge that actually are innate. Linguistic knowledge is in some important sense innate. We now know that. But by and large, scientific psychology comes down on the side of empiricism. The idea that most of what we know about the world, we know by virtue of experience, especially sensory experience, and that's why psychology has spent so much time trying to figure out how sensation and perception work. Let's first make some elementary distinctions between sensation and perception. Sensation asks and answers a basic, very, very simple question. The job of sensation is simply to detect the presence of some object or event in the environment. Basically, sensation answers the question of, is there something out there? Okay? When I see you, my sensory mechanisms are detecting the presence of you in the environment, and my sensory mechanisms also tell me there's a lot of you. Okay? So sensation basically says, is there something out there, and how intense is it? Okay? Very, very, very simple questions. Perception, the next stage in the information acquisition process, tries to answer some much more complicated questions, like where is the object? Is it in the left or the right? Is it up or down? Is it near or far? Okay? What is it doing? Is it static? Is it moving? Is it bending? Is it rigid? And finally, what is it? What's the identity of this object? What category of objects does it belong to? What are its capacities? What can it do to me? And not any less important, what can I do with it? So sensation detects the presence of an object in the environment. Perception identifies and categorizes that object, forms the mental representation of the object, which is the knowledge of the object we have in our minds. We can see a little bit better, I think, the relations between sensation and perception if we examine what I'd like to call the basic vocabulary of sensation and perception, which is a vocabulary that includes distal and proximal stimuli and transduction. The distal stimulus is the term that we use to refer to any object or event that occurs in the environment. Distal stimulus is any object or event that occurs in the environment. You're all distal stimuli to me. Your smiling faces, your turning paper, your coughing, all that stuff are distal stimuli. The proximal stimulus refers to the energy, the pattern of energy that is emanated by the distal stimulus and falls on my sensory receptors. So, for example, if there's a tree in my environment, that tree reflects light, and that light falls on the retinas of my eyes. If the tree is blowing in the wind, it's going to rustle, it's going to make some noise. Those sound waves are emitted by the tree, and they fall on on my ears. If I touch the tree, the texture of its bark, the smell of it, like if it's a eucalyptus tree or a pine tree or whatever, if I take a bite out of it, the taste of the tree, all of that stuff are, those things are the proximal stimuli that impinge on my sensory mechanisms. So the distal stimulus is the object. The proximal stimulus is the pattern of energy that is radiated or reflected by the object that falls on my sensory receptors. And it's the job of the sensory receptors to perform transduction, to transduce or transform that proximal stimulus into a pattern of neural impulses. The rods and cones in the retina of the eye take light waves and transduce light waves into neural impulses. The basilar membrane in the cochlea of the ear takes sound waves and transduces it into a pattern of electrical impulses, and so on, okay? So all of that is what sensation does. Taking a proximal stimulus, radiated by a distal stimulus, transducing it into a neural impulse, which is then transmitted via various afferent nerves into the cortex of the brain, at which point perceptual processes take over to form a mental representation of the distal stimulus, a mental representation of the tree, an image, if you will, of the tree that exists in my mind that represents or depicts, if you will, the tree that's outside. Both the physical features of the tree, is it tall, is it short, is it green, does it have leaves on it or whatever, and also the meaning of the tree. Perception forms this mental representation and analyzes it so that it identifies and categorizes the object. So now the question is, how do we get from the stimulus to the percept? How do we get from the pattern of stimulus energies radiating off the distal stimulus, transduced into a pattern of neural impulses sent to the various cortical sites in the brain to create a mental representation of that distal stimulus? One important view of this process, one take, if you will, on this process, is known as the ecological view of perception, and it is associated with two psychologists, a husband and wife team at Cornell University, both now gone, I'm afraid, James J. Gibson and Eleanor Jack Gibson, Jimmy and Jackie Gibson, who are very, very, very famous, very important perception psychologists who gave us this ecological view. What the Gibsons argued was that the way we get from sensation to perception, the way we get from the distal stimulus in the environment, that's why it's called the ecological view, okay, to the percept, occurs because every stimulus provides all the information you need to perceive the object or event in the environment. Every stimulus provides all the information needed for perception. And what perception involves is extracting this information from the pattern of stimulus energies, from the pattern of proximal stimulation that falls on sensory on the sensory receptors. Another name for the ecological view is direct perception, sometimes called direct realism, but more usually called direct perception. And again, it's called direct perception because in the Gibson's view, everything you need to perceive the world is supplied by the world itself, supplied by the distal stimulus and the pattern of proximal stimulation falling on your sensory receptors. And there's no need for any kind of so-called higher cognitive activity. There's no need to make inferences. There's no need to make use of judgment, of memory that's stored in your mind already, things you already know about the world. No need to engage in any kind of problem-solving activity. All the information you need for perception is supplied by the stimulus itself. And it turns out this is a very powerful view of perception. It can account for a lot of how perception works. It can account for, as you'll see in a minute, for the basic principles of depth perception, answering the question, is the object of perception near to me, close at hand, or is it far away? The ecological view can also account for most of motion perception, answering the question about the distal stimulus. Is the object stable in the environment, or is it moving around? And finally, it can account for what's known in the trade as the perception of plasticity, which just says, is the object rigid, or is it flexible in various kinds of ways. What I'm going to do is to illustrate the ecological view of perception by focusing on depth perception. But your textbook, Gleitman's text, has a very nice account of motion perception along similar lines, not so much on the perception of plasticity. If you take a perception course, you'll get a lot of that. So again, what the ecological view of perception says is that if you want to know where the object is, what it's doing, and what its basic form is, the object itself, the environment itself, supplies all the information that you need for this purpose. But there is a trick in the ecological view, and it's one that's important to understand, and that is that the ecological view defines the stimulus very broadly to include not just the object that you're looking at. If I'm looking at one of you, okay, you're the distal stimulus in my sensory field, but so is everything else, okay? So the idea here is that all the information needed for perception is supplied by the distal stimulus, the thing you're looking at, but also by the surrounding stimulus field, all the context that surrounds that object, basically the environmental context. If I'm looking at one of you, everybody else in the room, the chairs, everything else provides some of the context, and also information from my own body, as you'll see in a minute, provides some of the stimulus information needed for perception. But the idea is that it's all in the world. Everything you need for perception is provided by the stimulus environment, provided that you define the stimulus environment broadly enough to include both the object of regard and its context, both information in the environment and information coming from the perceiver's own body. Let's see how this works when we look at perception of distance. How do we know whether an object that we're looking at is close to us or far away? It turns out there are a number of cues provided by the stimulus environment that do a very good job of telling us whether an object is near or far away. And one of these cues is known as convergence. We call it a binocular cue for the perception of distance because this is a cue that requires that we have two eyes, okay? Doesn't work if you've only got one eye. Like if you cover one eye up, you lose the convergence cues. And the convergence cue basically comes from the fact that when you focus your eyes on an object, your eyes turn inward, okay? So if I'm focusing on you here, my eyes are turned inward. If I'm focusing on you back there, my eyes are turned inward. But if you think about your high school sophomore geometry for a second, it turns out that the angle of convergence is different when you're focusing your eyes on a nearby object than if you're focusing your eyes on an object that's far away. So that the angle of the two vectors, the angle created by the vectors, the eyes going to the object, is a very good indicator of distance for up to 30 or 40 feet. Here's a diagram that shows that this is the case. Here are two eyes converging on two objects, object A1 and object A2, and you can see that if the eyes are converging on this nearby object A1, the angle of convergence is relatively large. If the eyes are focusing on this relatively far away object, A2, the angle of convergence is relatively small. So you get depth information because you get feedback from the muscles of your eyes that tells you whether the angle of convergence is a big angle or a relatively small angle. Big angle means the object is nearby. A small angle means the object is far away. So here is a cue to distance, cue to depth, that's provided by the stimulus environment, but we haven't talked about the light waves radiating off the object yet. It's a stimulus environment, that some stimulus information is being provided by my own body. That is, the muscles in my eyes are sending feedback to my visual system about the angle of convergence that provides information as to whether the object is close or far away. Here is another cue that is also a binocular cue for the perception of distance. This is known as retinal disparity. It's also sometimes called binocular disparity, and it comes from the fact that your eyes are separated by a distance of a couple of inches. And by virtue of the fact that your two eyes are separated by a distance of a couple of inches, each eye receives a somewhat different image of the object in question. And so what happens is these two slightly different two-dimensional images, which are on the retinas of the eyes, are then fused into a three-dimensional image in the brain. But basically the idea is that the more disparity or less disparity is a cue for the perception of distance. It's actually the fact that each eye receives a somewhat different view of the object that produces the illusion of seeing things in depth. Here is a demonstration of that, okay? Here you've got your left eye and your right eye, and you're looking at these three objects. Object F is far away, object P is in the middle, object C is very close, and what you can see here is that each of these retinal views is a little bit different, okay? And then when the two images are sent to the visual system, they're fused into one. Here's an example of this. Just do this as a demonstration. Hold your left index finger at full arm's length, okay? Hold your right index finger at half arm's length and close your right eye. Close your right eye. Now align your two fingers using your left eye so that both of them coincide with the cross, okay? Do that. Now, having done that, close your left eye and open your right eye. Okay? See? Each of your eyes gets a somewhat different view of these objects, okay? And it's the disparity between them that helps to create an image of the world in depth. Okay, so we've got now these two different cues, convergence and retinal disparity. There are other cues for the perception of distance that are not binocular in nature, but instead are monocular in nature, meaning that they only require that you have one eye. If you close one eye, you still get this information about depth and distance. One monocular cue for depth or distance is known as accommodation, and this cue reflects the fact that when you focus on an object, the lens of your eye changes shape. Okay? If you focus on an object that is near to you, your lens has to bulge, it gets fat. And if you focus your eye on an object that is distant from you, the lens will stretch out and flatten. Again, this accommodation is produced by muscles in the eye. Okay, it doesn't happen all by itself. It's produced by muscles, in the special muscles in the eye. And these muscles send feedback to the visual system that tells the visual system whether they're flattening the lens or making a bulge in the lens in order to bring the object into focus. Here is a diagram of that. We've got two eyes here, and we've got an object that is close up. Here is the lens of the eye, and you can see it's got a little bulge in it back here. And here you've got an object that is relatively far away, and when the eye focuses on that, the lens has to flatten. It's just like in like a projector, for example, or some cameras. You have to do something very similar. But again, the point here is that there are muscles doing this, bulging and flattening, they provide feedback to the visual system that's part of the stimulus environment. This is information that's coming from the body of the perceiver in the same way that the angle of convergence comes from the body of the perceiver. Okay, so accommodation is one such so-called monocular cue for the perception of distance. Here's another one, very good cue for the perception of distance, known as relative size. And this relative size cue basically reflects another aspect of geometry known as the size-distance rule. If you hold the distance between the observer and two objects constant, if you hold the distance constant, the size of the object will directly control the size of the object of the image that the object casts on the retina. So object size will be a function of the image size if you hold distance constant. If you hold size constant, object distance is a function of the inverse of the image size. If you hold size constant, an object that's far away will cast a smaller image on the retina than an object that's up close. If you hold distance constant, large objects cast a large image on the retina, small objects cast a small image on the retina. If you hold size constant, close objects cast a large image on the retina, distant objects cast a small image on the retina. So you can take this information about the relative size of the retinal images, and that is information about distance. Here, it's a good example of this. Comes from Professor Palmer's book. Here we have an eye, and we have two trees, a close-up tree and a tree that's far away. The image of the close tree is larger than the image of the more distant tree, okay? So when you see, this is what the retinal image of those trees would look like, you see the one tree, the larger image, as closer to you than the smaller image. Relative size is an important cue to distance. If we have two objects that are pretty much the same size, okay, then the one that casts the larger image on the retina is going to be closer than the one that casts the smaller image on the retina. So relative size is another cue to distance, and it's a monocular cue. You don't need two eyes to get this cue. All you need is one eye to have retinal size be a cue to distance. Here is another monocular cue for the perception of distance, known as superposition. And superposition simply refers to the obvious fact, obvious once you think about it for a second, that nearby objects will cut off views of more distant objects. I am more distant from you than this podium, and the podium cuts off part of your view of me, because it's in front of me, right? I mean, it's very simple, but it's a profound cue. I now move in front of the podium, and you know I'm closer to you than the podium is because now I'm blocking your view of the podium. Superposition is a very powerful cue to distance. If something cuts off your view of something else, then obviously it's closer to you than that other object is. This is a cue that artists have used at least since the medieval period to depict distance, and it's also a cue that artists can have some fun with. Here's an example, okay? Just a kind of schematic example of superposition. You see the orange block closer to you than the green block because the orange cue cuts off your view of the green square. Here is a painting by the French surrealist painter René Magritte named Carte Blanche, in which he plays with the superposition cue for distance. Woman riding a horse through a forest. This tree cuts off your view of the horse's hindquarters, okay? This tree cuts off your view of the woman, but the woman cuts off your view of this tree, and the horse's forepart cuts off your view of this tree. It's a picture that doesn't make any sense, okay, as a depiction of the world. It doesn't work, but it's all done by screwing around with a superposition cue for distance, okay? Magritte is saying, I learned this cue in art school, and look what I can do with it. I can make this really interesting painting that, you know, the more you look at it, the odder it looks, and it's all because the distance relationships between the horse and rider on the one hand and the trees on the other hand have been played with. Okay, so superposition is another one of these important cues. Another monocular cue for the perception of distance, one that began to be used in painting in Renaissance art and is now very, very important in realistic painting, is linear perspective. And the idea behind linear perspective is that when objects are arranged in linear perspective, there are perspective lines that converge toward a vanishing point, and objects along those lines are foreshortened accordingly. Here's a famous example, a piece of Renaissance art, Raphael's School of Athens. Aristotle, Socrates, a bunch of other people. Used to be able to name them all, can't do that right now. But in any event, notice what's happening here. You see these people closer to you, this person somewhere in the middle, these people farther away, and then in the distance, this arch way behind them. This is a canvas. This is a two-dimensional painting, of course, but you see it as a three-dimensional scene. And the reason you see it as a three-dimensional scene is that Raphael has carefully constructed these images along perspective lines. Here's a kind of rough and ready analysis of the painting. If you follow these lines from the tops of the columns down, you see they converge right here in the dead center, in the center of the painting. If you take the lines suggested by the tiling in the floor here and follow them right up, again, they converge right in the dead center of the painting, and then various objects are now foreshortened as you move along the perspective lines. So here's a character here, this person in white, who is about that tall, and here is Socrates, okay, who is painted as shorter than that, about how he'd look if he were that far away along the perspective lines. Here's a person in the middle, and that's the height of that figure is somewhere in between the height of this figure and the height of that figure. These perspective lines, when you took art in grade school, they taught you to do this, right? They said, draw these lines, you know, and then make sure that everybody is arrayed along them. This is a technique that was basically discovered in the 14th century. People didn't know about it before the 14th century, and it's been used ever since to depict depth and distance in two-dimensional space. And it turns out that our visual systems use the same kind of information. When I'm looking at you now, especially if I'm looking down this row, I get this nice perspective line that converges back there a little bit. People up here, you're pretty big. People back there, you're pretty little, right? And it all fits together with the regular foreshortening along the perspective lines. So linear perspective, very, very important cue to distance. Again, since the Renaissance at least, painters have tried to paint scenes as if you were looking at a scene through a window, and the frame supplies that window. Here's a painting by Magritte that basically plays on this principle. You've got a canvas on an easel. It's a canvas of a field with a tree in it. And notice that this shrubbery here is continuous with the shrubbery that you view out the window. Again, an artist would use cues like linear perspective to create the image that the painting is just what the world would look like outside if you were looking at it through a window. Here's another example. Magritte loved to do this, okay? Never mind what these titles are. He was a surrealist. The titles don't have anything to do with the painting. But you can see again, here is the easel, here's the canvas, there's a cluster of houses here. In the painting we have the horse cart and most of the house, a little bit of shrubbery here, but it's continuous with the rest of this. Magritte is lining up his perspective lines so as to create the illusion that you're looking at the world through the window of the canvas. Here is another Magritte. I love Magritte, don't you? The Promenades of Euclid, where Magritte has done something very interesting with the lines of perspective. So here we've got another easel, another canvas, right? The scene looking out a window. There's this tower here with the conical top on it, kind of Disneyland tower. And then there's this long boulevard receding into the distance. You can see here clearly the visual perspective lines running to the vanishing point, creating the illusion, the impression that these houses down here are farther away from the viewer than these houses are here. Okay, see how he's done that? Notice, however, that this conical tower top is exactly the same in shape and size as the converging lines in this boulevard. These are exactly the same shape and size, okay? But you don't see these as converging lines. Why? Because Magritte has used the principle of superposition to get you to see this tower as being in front of this, this apartment building. There's no superposition cue here. Rather, you see these as perspective lines and the world going out into the distance. It's a very charming, I think, illustration of how realistic painters, Magritte would probably turn over in his grave if he heard me call him a realistic painter, but that's what it is. It's a painting of a boulevard, right? To use these cues to depth to communicate depth and to represent depth and distance. Okay, here's another cue that's commonly used. Elevation, distance from the horizon. When you look out at the world, distant objects appear closer to the horizon than nearby objects do. Just next time you're looking at the world, check that out, and you'll see that it's true. Here is a schematic depiction of it. We've got a horizon here. We've got a tree here. We've got a tree here. These trees are the same size, but you perceive this tree as closer to you than this tree. Distant objects are closer to the horizon than nearby objects. Here's another example from Professor Palmer. Here's an array of trees, a horizon, some mountains, and some clouds, and notice that these trees appear closer to you than these trees. These trees are closer to the horizon, they appear farther away, and that this cloud appears farther away than these clouds. Again, the cloud is closer to the horizon. So it's not a matter of up and down, okay? It's not a matter of being high in the image or low on the image. It's a matter of where you are with respect to the horizon. Another cue for the perception of distance known as aerial perspective or atmospheric perspective. And this cue works because in the air there are dust particles or sometimes water particles or other liquid particles that diffract the light, okay, and produce a kind of bluing. The more distance there is between you and the object, the more dust and water there is in the air between you and the object, and more bluing actually occurs. Here are two really good examples of this. This is a photograph of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. One of the reasons the Blue Ridge Mountains look blue, they don't look blue if you're sitting on a Blue Ridge Mountain. It looks very green because trees are green, okay? The reason that the Blue Ridge Mountains look blue is that these the trees on these mountains emanate a kind of oil that diffracts light in the distance. Here's another example. This is a photograph of Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. And close by, you see all this green. And then as you go to look at the more distant volcanoes, you see they turn blue. Again, that's because even in such a pristine environment as Lake Atitlan, there's still a lot of dust and stuff in the air, and that creates a bluing of what would otherwise be green. The bluer it is, the further away it is. To make a long story short, these are always good cues to distance. And finally, I think this is finally, another cue for depth is texture gradients, and that simply means that there is more texture apparent in an object that's close at hand than there is in an object that's far away. When I look at you, I can see kind of down here, I can see kind of individual hairs and things like that. I can see your shoelaces. When I look at somebody back there, I don't get anything like that. I know there are laces on that shoe, but I just can't see them. Here are some photographic depictions of this, a beach scene. These rocks are closer to the observer. You can see a lot of detail. These rocks, same kind of rocks, farther away, they blur into the distance. Here is a crowd scene at a football stadium. You see a lot of detail here, but in the objects that are farther away, much less. So there's a gradient of texture. Okay, the more texture, the more detail you can see, the closer the object is. And then finally, we have shadowing as an index to depth. This comes from the fact that our visual systems evolved in an environment where there was only one source of light, the sun or the moon, and it was always, pretty much always, overhead. When you evolve a visual system in an environment where the source of light is always overhead, then the pattern of shadows communicates the depth and distance. Okay? So here, these three circles here, you perceive them as convex. You perceive them as coming out of the screen towards you, whereas you perceive these three circles as concave, as dented into the screen going away from you. Again, see the pattern of light here. These are illuminated, casting a shadow. There's a shadow here, and this is illuminated. That's an impression that's created simply by how the light works. You can see this very clearly. If you flip it upside down, these used to be on the bottom, these used to be on the top, but now, okay, what was once convex is now concave, and what was once convex, what was once concave is now convex, all because of the pattern of light. So again, it's the pattern of light radiating off the object that communicates what's distant and what's nearby. So what we've got now is a whole set of cues, some binocular in nature, requiring two eyes, some monocular in nature, requiring only one eye, some ocular in nature, because the information is provided by the eyes themselves and the muscles attached to them, and others optical in nature, having to do with the pattern of light that falls on the retina of the eye. These cues together create the perception of depth or distance in vision, and, as the Gibsons would want to remind us, all the information that you need for perception of distance is provided by the stimulus itself, provided you define the stimulus broadly enough to include the figure as well as the ground, information in the light, and information in the muscles as well. Information coming to the perceiver and information in the body of the perceiver. All the information for perception is provided by the stimulus. Not quite true, as I'll explain on Wednesday. Thank you very much.